All right, hello, Mr. and Mrs. North America and all the ships at sea. Excuse me, except I should be saying hello, Navakavadans and everywhere. This is Otto Excelsior of Navakavada.org. And I'd like to, before I say anything else, give a shout out to one of our sponsors, SodaFinder.com. SodaFinder.com, rare and exotic sodas from around the country and around the world delivered to your door. Today, on our latest segment of Nuts and Bolts Buddhism, we're going to be taking with Panyabasa, who has been on our show many times before, so he needs very little introduction to our regular viewers. And today I was going to ask him about the changing perspectives we have, especially when we first begin to practice Buddhism, when we, take a path different from the others around us. We change our thinking and we often change our behavior, and people around us see us differently and we see them differently. So I wanted to ask you today, Panyabasa, what sort of experience have you had with, people changing their views of you after you became a Buddhist and vice versa?
Well, they didn't really change their views of me very much until after I became a monk, and then the change of view was rather radical. But I mean, at first I didn't even really consider myself to be a Buddhist until I became a monk, because I wasn't even keeping 5 precepts. Especially the beer drinking part was
Yes,
it was difficult. I was ordained temporarily, just sort of as a dress rehearsal, as a novice, and the old monk who ordained me as a novice after I was returning to layman status asked me if I could keep 5 precepts, and I said probably not, because it was mainly the beer drinking, because all my friends drank, and although I wasn't really much of a lush at the time, nevertheless it was just it's like the social lubricant in the West, or at least where I came from. If you didn't drink beer, I mean, you're pretty much a non-entity socially. So there was that. And then after I became a monk, of course, then it was just completely radical. That was largely because I was, I'm essentially a different person. It's like my attitude changed so radically that, and my behavior changed so radically. And then also I was living in a monastery. So, all my old friends dropped away, with just a few would keep in touch, from time to time, but that was about it. But if people would ask me if I was a Buddhist before I became a monk, I'd say, no, but I aspire to be one someday. It's like I'm a Buddhism enthusiast.
An aficionado.
Yeah, I didn't really call myself a Buddhist just because I wasn't keeping even the bare minimum of 5 precepts.
Right. So. Huh. Well, knowing you as I do, and I think anyone that knows you would agree, you tend to be an all or nothing kind of a guy, in as much as if you decide you're going to be a monk, you're going to be a monk. You're not going to pussyfoot around it. You're going to go full monk. So I imagine it was a very radical change in your lifestyle and behavior when you took the plunge.
Your audio is going all over the place.
Is it really? How about now?
Yeah, it's fine right now.
Okay, I think it was because I touched this here. I've had issues with that. Sorry about that. We'll rephrase. I'll just edit this out. Thank goodness for editing technology. Anyway, so you are a person who, when you decide to do something, you do it all the way. You don't pussyfoot around. And I imagine that when you became a monk, when you made that really, really radical change in your life, it was a very sharp cut in your behavior. How did your family react to that sudden change?
Well, my father and my brother were proud of me. My father thought I was being somewhat of an extremist, but nevertheless, he was proud of me. And my mother just didn't get it at all. She didn't have a religious or philosophical bone in her body. She mainly wanted grandchildren, So, yeah, she was just confused and not very pleased with the whole situation.
Oh. So when you did make this big change, did you find it was easier to change completely and permanently rather than try to segue your way into Buddhism? Do you think this is one of the reasons, helped you to become a Buddhist?
I think for me, it was easier than just trying to ease into it. Just plunging headfirst into it was such a radical change that it really struck me with the radicalness of it. Whereas if you're going to try and ease into it, then you might not ease very far before you just kind of peter out and just, you're just going beyond your comfort zone or whatever. And I don't know, it just, for me, it just seemed like just diving headfirst into it was more effective.
It must have been very consciousness altering. That's, what all I can think about, to so completely change everything you were doing. That must have also been changing your mental outlook quite a bit.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was definitely a radical change all across the board. Just my behavior changed radically. My surroundings changed radically, and I think it's more that way for Westerners, like Western people who are ordained as monastics. They're not just following along with their culture the way a lot of like Asian Buddhists do. It's like their families urging them to become a monk, and
Right.
it's just a high status thing, and they get like a free education at the monastic schools and so forth. But it's you're reading a book, you're reading ancient texts that say it is possible to become fully enlightened, to know ultimate reality in this life, and all you have to do is follow this and this. And so I considered it to be a sacred duty to at least give it a shot. And so, yeah, it was. I mean, I hesitated. I gave myself a few years to get ready. I made my aspiration. I started aspiring to becoming a monk when I was about 17.
Oh,
But
okay.
I decided that I should definitely be a monk by the age of 30 because I still liked girls and ice cream and rock and roll and all that. And
Right, yeah.
so I was kind of, I set myself a deadline, and I beat the deadline. I ordained when I was 27. So there is that. But yeah, it's sort of like joining the military or something, just getting thrown into basic training or something like that might be comparable.
Well, it's an interesting point you make too about being an Occidental, being a Westerner. It's a much greater change than somebody living in an Asian country where Buddhism is a very normal thing, and as we've talked about before, temporary ordainment is very common. So for somebody in an Asian country, it wouldn't be as much of a disconnect from their previous culture. In fact, it's part of their culture. I was very impressed with that myself. The times I was able to stay at the monastery out in California and see the way Burmese people interacted with their clergy was very enlightening. But now, when you were ordained, now you took a temporary ordainment first. Then
Yeah, I was ordained as a novice for like 5 weeks, a year and a half or so before I really went for it.
now, when you really went for it, when you did your well, I don't want to say final ordainment, but your last ordainment, which sounds almost as bad. But did you do that in the United States, or did you do that over in Burma?
I was ordained at a Burmese monastery in California.
Okay, so by this time, had you learned Burmese or much Burmese or Pali?
Almost none. I was studying Pali, so I knew just sort of broken Pali. I knew almost no Burmese when I went to Burma.
Hmm. So is that common for American monks showing up in Burma? Is there a basic? Burmese is not a language that I've ever seen offered in high school or anything. It's not
Yeah.
commonly something that people have access to learning in the States,
Yeah, probably relatively few universities even teach it.
unless they're in Burma, of course.
Yeah, but
But
I think most American monks or American people wanting to be ordained in Burma, they go to like the international meditation centers where there's always somebody who speaks English and teaches in English. But I went about it differently, so that the first monastery I stayed at, nobody spoke English. I didn't speak Burmese, and so I was communicating at first with a monk who had some Buddhist education, and we were speaking like broken Pali,
oh wow,
communicating by speaking broken Pali with this other monk. One other monk knew enough Pali that we could communicate.
my goodness,
Yeah.
that's well, that's very interesting. So what you're also implying here is that the level of education in Pali is not great in some of these monasteries?
Um, Burmese monks, I mean, there's lots of scholar monks in Burma, except I was going to this remote forest monastery where it was mostly just, simple village types who were ordaining, mostly local ones.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of monasteries in Burma, especially the school monasteries, where most of the monks there would be able to hold up their end of a conversation in Pali. But yeah, I didn't go to that kind. I was more interested in the ascetic forest tradition.
Right. Applying yourself. But you did, of course, learn Pali to a point where you could translate texts, and you've actually got some, or at least one translation that you did that was published, right? The other Kavaga?
Yeah.
So
plus I've translated a few other things that are, I think it's in my first book, sort of my shorter translations.
So where do you just did this? Just picked it up yourself, or were you able to take classes in Pali, or?
Well, when I first became a monk, maybe even like before I was a monk, I had a Pali teacher at the monastery in California, and we were following some Sinhalese monks' Pali grammar course. So I read the first two books. There was a third book that was more advanced, but it just seemed like readings in poetry and stuff that I wasn't much interested in. So I just read the first two volumes of this Pali grammar with the aid of a teacher who, I mean, he wasn't a master in Pali or anything, but he knew more than I did. And then after that, I just started reading relatively simple Pali texts. And then you've got the dictionary and you've got the Pali grammar to help you with weird declensions and verb tenses and so forth.
Right.
And you just do it on your own. That's what I did.
Well, you've always struck me as having an instinct to be an autodidact, if you'll pardon the expression. You're somebody that likes to learn things. So if you've got access to books, you're going to learn things. And so now,
yeah, it used to strike me that having a teacher was cheating.
That's an interesting way to look at it. Well, I always was told that any of the suttas, and whether it's Buddhist or Hindu sutras, I guess you'd say for them, are simply a thread that you're supposed to have a teacher to give you the full body of the doctrine, but that the teachers are for those things that can't be written down, sort of thing. It's like what do you need a college for except for like labs? You can have access to all the books, or someone to answer questions that might be propounded in the books that you don't understand immediately. So.
Yeah, well, according to Theravadan tradition, you're required to have a teacher for your first 5 years as a monk, and then once you've you learned the basics, you learned how to follow the rules, and you've learned how to meditate, and you've learned how to bake a bowl and sew robes and all that, then you can just go alone like the horn of the rhinoceros. You just go alone out in the forest and practice.
So you had an assigned teacher for the first 5 years, or they switch around, or?
Well, you have to have, when you first are ordained, your teacher is your preceptor, which is the monk, the senior monk that ordains you. Okay. And then if he turns out not to be convenient, or you move somewhere or whatever, then you have to take an acharya, and you have to live independence on a teacher, a senior monk who has been a monk for at least 10 years. So yeah, when I went to Burma, I had a couple of different acharyas.
So it's sort of like an apprenticeship system.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. Now, after you went through this, then you mentioned before and just now earlier that you had a predilection for going out into the forest. You wanted to, your emphasis was on practice rather than theory. So you wound up going up into the hill country. In fact, you referred to hillbillies.
Yeah, I was after I had my 5 years and was free to go out and live by myself, I was looking for good forests in Burma. Mm-hmm. And then there was this one national park, Alando Kathapa National Park in northwestern Burma or Myanmar, that I was told by a Forest Service guy, it's one of the few parks or wildlife refuges in the country that hasn't been completely just raped to death and ruined by village encroachment and woodcutters and just the government just going in and logging it and that kind of a thing. So I went there, and the park is shaped sort of like the Vulcan Live Long and Prosper sign.
Oh, wow. Nice.
You know, it's all this is the center of the park, and then there's like these two ridges of hills that kind of go this way. And I found a place right here that was surrounded by a national park on three sides and had two villages that were easy to go to within walking distance, so I could go for alms food. So I lived there for a few years, but it was just lots of malaria there. I got malaria at least once every year that I went there. And in the rainy season, it was very difficult to live there. So I used to just spend the hot season there, you know, up in the hills where it's a little cooler. And then after the rain started, I would come back down and go somewhere else. But I spent one rainy season there, and that was plenty.
Wow. So this is now I'm trying to segue a little bit here. Now you've talked before, and this is getting into something I wanted to talk about the people that you met up in the hinterlands. People that, although they live simple lives, actually seem to be pretty happy people, and really doesn't seem to be suffering enough, perhaps, as some people would say, from their lack of like material possessions. And you wrote a very interesting essay called "Happiness Kicks Butt" that I was very impressed with. And I wonder if you talk a little more about your experience with people who are happy when perhaps mainstream people would say that they shouldn't be happy because of their lack of things.
Yeah. Well, that whole essay, I wrote it when I was living in a cave in central Burma, and this nice Bangladeshi lady gave me this book. I can't remember the idea of justice or something like that by Amartya Sen, who also was Bangladeshi. So there was a little jingoism or something involved in her giving me the book, maybe. But he was a Nobel. He won the Nobel Prize in economics. He was an economist. And I was impressed by. I mean, he had kind of a plodding way of writing and probably of thinking also. You know, it would take him more than the usual number of sentences to get his point across, but he seemed really sensible. You know, I was impressed by, you know, his common sense until he got into these chapters on, or especially this one chapter on happiness. And he just could not understand that, I mean, other economists had already found out that the increase in wealth does not cause increase in happiness.
Right.
And it's like some kind of dilemma or paradox for him. He just doesn't get it. And still, he just assumes as an economist that quality of life is based on, you know, the amount of money you make and the standard of living. You know, this just essentially the standard of living determines how happy you're going to be, which is totally untrue. I mean, at one extreme, you've got people like Michael Jackson, who were, you know, they had everything they wanted, and still they were just miserable basket cases.
Yeah.
And at the other end, you've got these, you know, Burmese hillbillies living, you know, the way people have lived in most respects, you know, for thousands of years. And they just, partly because they're Buddhists, I guess, they're happy. I mean, Buddhism teaches, you know, desire is the cause of all suffering, and they just didn't have many desires. You know, if the farmers would want good weather, you know, if it was a drought or something, they wouldn't be happy. Or, of course, if the baby is sick or something, you're unhappy.
Right.
But for the most part, they were very happy people. And this Amartya Sen guy he was actually saying that, I mean, even these happy people, you know, they're just sort of making the best of a miserable situation, and they really shouldn't be happy. And it's like, he's talking about like women in India who, I mean, some of them seem well adjusted to the fact that, you know, they don't have the same status as men. And it's like he wants them to be educated so that they can start being unhappy about not being feminists and living in a the traditional culture, essentially. So
Wow.
it just seems so ridiculous to me that, there have been people living. For example, there was a study done on quadriplegics, people who had like broken their necks in a skiing accident or something, and they found out that, after like 2 months to adjust, they were just as happy or unhappy as they were before. It's a matter of attitude and not a matter of how much money you make or how many sensual pleasures you have and so forth.
Right. Right.
And of
It's
course, people like
yeah.
the Buddha and Jesus of Nazareth were teaching their most serious disciples that if you want the ultimate bliss, you're going to have to renounce everything. You're going to have to go penniless and wander around homeless and this sort of thing.
Right.
So in a way, it's the exact opposite of what the economists assume.
Hmm. Yeah. Consider the lilies in the field, right?
Yeah, God will provide.
Yeah. Yeah.
Probably.
Well, one can hope. We'll provide something, but we won't go into that. No, well, I think it's pretty obvious that any sort of happiness is going to come from your own inner self, your own attitude to what's happening to you, not in just externals in and of themselves. But of course, I think we do have a society which encourages people to look outside themselves for happiness because that's where you make the money. And you can really, really want that wristwatch. Oh, I want that. I gotta have. It's got all these dials and stuff, and you think this is going to make you happy. And, you buy it and you look at it, and it's really cool for about a week or two. And you're thinking about the next wristwatch. And I have met people like that were constantly, they had to have the latest, biggest TV set, a new car every 3 years, whether they needed it or not. And of course, it always wears off. But somebody makes a lot of money off that. Whereas, um, I've found that you people who are going to be happy, people who are happy and have a happy attitude tend to be happy no matter what the details of their external circumstance are. And some people, like you were saying, some people are going to be miserable. They can have Michael Jackson levels of wealth, but if they haven't addressed their inner issues, they're just, it's does them no good at all. And in fact, it probably hurts a lot of the people around them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think poor people are unhappy mainly because they've been taught to be ashamed of being poor, or else they've got like rich people living in the area that they can sort of be jealous of and want to be like them. So that causes some unhappiness. But in a Burmese village where everybody is, I mean, some people are slightly higher up on the scale and some people are slightly lower down, but it's just the way things are, and so they just accept it with modicum of equanimity, which is good.
Now, do you think this is part of the Burmese national character, or do you think that Buddhism has been responsible for inculcating this, or maybe a combination of the two? Does Buddhism kind of reflect an attitude that people have in Asia?
Yeah, my experience in Burma is probably, even if they were Muslims, they'd probably be less unhappy than the average Western city dweller. But still, I think Buddhism has helped because obviously Buddhism does teach, the second noble truth is all suffering or all unhappiness is caused by desire. So, right. And the Burmese, they can tolerate situations that would have Western people just in tears or climbing the walls or raging like a lunatic. It's really strange. Like they're immune to noise. They like noise apparently. And
you mentioned that, yeah.
And let's see, what was I going to say? I was going to say something, but I forgot. Never mind.
Something about loudspeakers.
Yeah, well, I mean, they like that, and I mean, that's just common throughout the third world, I think, that they just you got like loudspeakers just blasting cheesy pop music or monks chanting or whatever. Sometimes they'll start up at 4 a.m, and people next door to the loudspeakers, and probably the teacups are rattling on the shelves. It's so loud.
Wow.
And Westerners, we just can't stand it, but like for example, Schopenhauer wrote about Goethe, who was one of the most intelligent, a savant. The man was a savant, and he once bought a neighbor house just so that he could, because it was being remodeled and he just wanted to get rid of the carpenters and all the banging and pounding and that sort of thing. He just bought the house in order to dismiss
just to quiet them down. All right, you're all fired.
And Schopenhauer wrote an essay on why it is that the more intelligent you are, the less you like noise. And he had some weird theory about like the auditory nerve going past this other part of the brain or whatever. But I think it's just a matter of not being able to hear yourself think, because mostly we think verbally. We think in words, and it's. I mean, if you got all kinds of noise and commotion going on around you, you can't really concentrate on what you yourself are thinking. And people that are like, subsistence farmers with a 4th grade education, they don't think very much anyway, so they're just quite content to have like thoughts just fed into their head through loudspeakers.
The music will come out and they'll just hum along with the song and whatever's coming out. Well, it's interesting. I don't know if you've ever read Sir Richard Francis Burton's book, A Personal Narrative of a Journey to El Medina and Mecca. But he talks about, that's the famous journey he took in disguise as a Muslim. He pretended to be actually a Pathan, an Afghanistani Muslim, or an Indian Muslim of Afghanistani descent. But be that as it may, he noted one of the things in the character of the people he moved amongst was the constant noise, activity, and the not being left alone. And he said that you lived very communally, and if you come in, people want to know everything about you. They want to look in your luggage. They expect to be really in your face and know your business all the time. So he had to tell his hosts that he had a certain melancholy psychological condition where he needed to be alone sometimes. And he said that he put it down to, this is something that Westerners need to have time to themselves, where they can be quiet, where they can have privacy. And he, for him, it was like an East-West kind of thing, and of course, probably racially based. But I do remember him pointing that out. So when you're talking, what you're saying seems to confirm his own observation. And another thing I was thinking of was when you were talking about how Burmese people and people in Asia in general can put up with things like noise and crowding and so forth. I think part of it is the way we're taught to be impatient. I think most cultures, you try to teach your children to be patient. I was taught, wait, it's okay, take, haste makes waste. Now you turn on the television set, which I don't do it myself, but I sometimes see television sets in other people's houses. It seems to be all about do it now. You want this, have it now. Don't wait. And the cool person is the person that doesn't wait, cuts off other people, steals that parking spot. So you've got a culture that's actively teaching people to be impatient and to not tolerate any sort of frustration.
What was it in the Huxley's Brave New World? What never put off till tomorrow the pleasure you can have today, or something like one that. Of the mantras that just gets fed into the children and everybody.
Yeah.
I mean, like TV commercials or consumerism in general, it's like it's just taken for granted that any kind of inconvenience or discomfort is going to make you unhappy, and you've got to buy whatever it is that they're selling in order to avoid the inconvenience or discomfort, because inconvenience and discomfort necessarily cause misery, which is not true at all. Even pain is not the same as suffering. Some like athletes or mountain climbers that like really going for it, they just like the burn and the just the discomfort is just exhilarating for them, that they can tell you that pain or discomfort, it's not the same as unhappiness.
Oh yeah, and so much of it, well, it depends upon our mindset. I mean, if you plunge into freezing cold water, if you're a swimmer, that's a great exhilarating thing. You're starting your laps. Whereas, for somebody who doesn't like to swim, they jump in. Oh, it's cold. I mean, you're getting the same stimulus, but it's two completely different, down to the bones attitude. That one guy that's plunging in for his morning, lap around the pool, and he can't wait to feel that cold water, whereas somebody else, for which it's a horrible thing. but it all starts with mental attitudes.
Yeah, perceptions.
Yeah.
So it's like changing perceptions. It's like, I think it was Schopenhauer's first philosophical essay that ever got published. It was like his doctoral thesis, The Fourfold Root of Sufficient Reason, I think it was called. But he pointed out something really profound, I think, and that's that there's like a psychological necessity. So a person with a certain personality or character is going to react the same way to the same circumstances, and the only way you can change how you react to the circumstances is by changing your perceptions.
That is pretty profound, actually. I think that pretty much hits the nail on the head as far as that goes.
Yeah, and that's pretty much what I mean. When you were asking me about changing perceptions, I thought it might be something along those lines. I wasn't. I didn't know it was going to be about other people's perceptions of me. But if you do,
well, I was planning on also. That was actually in my mind to talk about your changing perceptions of the people around you as well. Because of course, as you proceeded along the path is in your Buddhism, and especially because, as you said, you weren't really a Buddhist the way you were after you became a monk earlier on. So, as you advanced in your practice, how did your perceptions change of the people around you, especially old friends and family, if you don't mind my asking?
Well, at first I was just extremely idealistic and semi-fanatical, and then I started realizing that reality doesn't work that way. That it's, Buddhism is not the way you read it in the text or you read about it in popular books. Like I thought, like I was interested in Zen at first. Mm-hmm. Went to a Zen monastery in California also. And if you read the books, you think that Zen is these men dressed in black pajamas standing around talking in riddles and hitting each other with sticks.
Yeah.
And that appealed to me. I kind of liked that idea, but it was very different. I mean, it just wasn't that way. You got men and women, putting on their layman's clothing and driving to the grocery store, and just all this chanting that you never mentions that much in the text. Just chanting. And just all Pure Land Buddhist elements in Zen now that really, it doesn't appeal to me.
Right.
So so then I became disillusioned and just kind of sullen for a few years, and then I went to Burma. It was maybe a year and a half or so, and then I went to Burma, and then it was just being plunged into this alien landscape. Almost the same as just going in a time machine back to ancient India.
Wow.
Because, it's just blazing hot, no electricity, no running water, and just people are still living pretty much the way they did in the Buddhist time. They had radios and rubber flip-flops and that kind of a thing, but the men would still take the team of bullocks out into the field to plow, and the girl would take the clay pot balanced on her head down to the river or well to get water for the hut, So then it was, I was just kind of trying to live like an ancient Indian Buddhist monk as well as I could. But it doesn't really work that way because, you wake up with like Led Zeppelin playing in your head, or something reminds you of an episode of Gilligan's Island or something. You can't stop being a modern Westerner, even if you're outwardly living like an ancient Indian ascetic. But then as you practice, you get insights occasionally, and that changes your perceptions. Like the idealism kind of fades out, and just the dogmatism. At first, you don't know much from your own experience, so you just take it on faith, reading the texts, or you'll just kind of follow along with what the Asian monks are doing because you think that they probably know what they're doing. And then then eventually you realize that in many respects, they're just sort of blindly following along with their tradition that they don't even understand. Not in all respects, but in a lot of respects it's that way. So as your meditation gets better, then you start understanding reality better, and then that changes your perceptions and just changes the way you sort of look at the universe and at yourself. Although with regard to other people, I think I've got more patience and more compassion for other people Because part of the thing is, like, before you practice meditation and so forth, you just think you're surrounded by idiots or whatever. And
Right.
then you try to purify yourself, you try to perfect yourself, and you realize you can't do it. It's like it just doesn't work that way. That we're just kind of stuck being these uh, fallible, messed up
Right.
people. And then you start having a more compassion for messed up people, because you realize that everybody's messed up. Even probably an enlightened being in some respects is still messed up. He's just not identifying with the messed upness anymore. But that's
Right.
just nature taking its course. I mean, we're just a kind of glorified ape anyway.
Right. A big blob of protoplasm on two legs.
Yeah.
Mm.
So I get along with messed up people. People lie to me. It doesn't really bug me. Just I don't
That's
know.
what you expect, right? Of course, people are
Yeah,
going to
well,
lie.
like in Burma, it's some people. I mean, my father told me that the Eskimos. He lived in Alaska for a long time, and I don't know what the politically correct word for Alaskan Eskimos is now. It doesn't even matter. But he said that they don't have a word for lie in their language.
Huh.
Nevertheless, they all lie. It's just considered to be like bad manners to tell people what they don't want to hear. So you just
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So you just make up bullshit to make them happy, and that's considered to be being, well mannered. It's like you're polite and everything. And it's the same way in a lot of traditional cultures, including Burma, to some degree. Some people take honesty very seriously, but sometimes they'll just be buttering you up and telling you all this bullshit that isn't true. But still, it's like, it never really bothered me.
Or being circuitous and talking around things and never quite. You mentioned when one of the things that happened when you were considering disrobing, was that there had been some talk of you taking over a monastery in the forest tradition and I think it turned into a school instead. And the abbot had he kind of when I read your article, I seem to recall you said something to the effect that he had promised this other monk to use it as school, but he kind of didn't really want to tell you because he liked you, so he was kind of circuitous about letting you
Yeah,
know.
yeah. Yeah. I actually came very close to just being a monk for the rest of my life in Burma, because the last time I was in Burma, um, I volunteered that this monk. He was the only monk at this monastery. It was a nice monastery. It was originally set up for monks in Western monks in my tradition that couldn't take the blazing heat of the lowlands. So I was obviously
A perfect
um,
candidate, yeah.
yeah, I was just the obvious choice. And he was always like, well, I don't know for sure yet. I don't know what's going to happen. And then I found out, like, after maybe a year, that he had already given permission to this other Burmese scholar monk to just set up a school monastery there. But he didn't want to tell me, which is kind of understandable.
uh, uh, yeah.
So then I came back to America, and here I am wearing a shirt with a beard.
Yes, and hair on your head.
Yeah.
Yeah. On a dog ranch.
Yeah, pretty much.
I always think of it as a dog ranch. I
Yeah.
don't, or a cat ranch sometimes. I didn't notice any cats or dogs running about with you right now, though.
No, no, I got the door closed, although a couple of them have come to the door, kind of making little whimpery noises and then going back.
Oh, don't leave them out there on our account.
Mm.
Oh. Oh, so now, how long were you in Burma before you went back and visited your family for the first time? I was just wondering how they reacted after you'd been a monk for a while.
Well, the first time I went back to visit my folks was in 1997, after I'd been in Burma about 4 years. And yeah, it was very kind of awkward. It was
Really, really.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was trying to follow the rules and everything. I was still sort of semi-fanatical and strict, and wouldn't touch my stepmother and that kind of a thing, because
Wow. Wow. But yeah, because you're a monk, you're not supposed to touch chicks. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And Yeah, it was kind of strange. I mean, it was like I was a different person or something.
Wow. Did you see them differently though, or did you have like a different way of looking at them?
Um, I'm sure that there was some change just because of like the changes in myself, sort of like I was alluding to earlier with
Right.
when you start realizing that you are messed up and you're pretty much stuck being that way, that it changes, it just kind of changes your perspective on other people.
So you could be more patient with your family.
Yeah, to some degree.
Yeah. Because family is always the tough one.
Yeah. Plus, also, you're like working on your own consciousness. You're trying to be as fully conscious as possible, and
Right.
then you're dealing with like an aging father who's telling the same stories over and over again, and there's a certain amount of compassion in that also, I think.
Wow. Wow. So when you became a monk and then you went back to the States, um, you were, as you point out, somewhat fanatical or semi-fanatical. How was traveling through the States? I mean, you have restrictions on like what you can wear on your feet when you're a monk. When I was associating with you when you were a monk, you went barefoot much of the time, or only with the most primitive kind of footwear. So, did you have any trouble traveling? I was just wondering about that, going through airports and things like that in the
Um,
States.
One time at SeaTac Airport, I was required to put on shoes just because I might step on something sharp and then like sue the airport or something. So
Oh,
they had
really?
to actually get my luggage off the plane so I could dig through it and find my flip-flops and put them on.
Okay. So
And
those are still allowable though in the Vinya.
technically, you're not supposed to wear shoes in public. But
Oh,
when they're telling you you have to, then I mean, it's just a minor rule if you break it anyway.
oh,
But
okay.
yeah, I mean, even most strict monks will break that one. That technically it is against the rules. It's a dukkha offense or an offense of wrongdoing requiring confession if you wear shoes in public. That you're allowed to wear them at the monastery or in the forest, like uninhabited areas. But if you're walking through a town or a village or something, it's it's against the rules to wear shoes. So I usually went barefoot. I'd wear shoes maybe twice a year for 20 years or so. But the main problem with being a monk going through airports is not handling money. I
Oh,
was, yeah, I was like stuck in the airport in Denpasar, Bali, a couple times because it's $30 for a visa when you get there, and
oh my.
yeah, it's like I was just stuck. I couldn't buy the visa, and I'm like in the arrivals. I mean, you couldn't get to the part. You have to go through customs and everything before you get to the people that have come to pick you up,
Oh
and they
wow.
can't
Yeah.
get to me. So
Oh
yeah, I got stuck a couple times. Or I
wow.
mean, it's really. I mean, you're at the airport and you've already been dropped off. You don't have any money, of course, and then you hand over your ticket to the girl behind the counter, and she types it everything in, and then she frowns, looks at the screen, types it in again, frowns, and then she calls like the manager over, and he's typing it, and they're talking in some language you don't understand. And it's like, man, am I going to get out of here or what?
Sounds
So
like
there was a
that.
lot of that. That was the most difficult part about traveling. But like visiting Aberdeen, Washington, where my parents lived back in the 90s, I felt very self-conscious just walking down the street in monk's robes, barefoot, with a shaven head. And I have to admit that by like 2011, when I came back and truly tried to stay in America, even though it didn't work out the way I expected, um, that it was like America had become like progressive enough that you could
Yeah.
walk down the street barefoot in monk's robes, and you didn't have to worry that. I mean, I got dirty looks occasionally, but I mean, you can walk down the street in like a black evening gown and spike heels, and nobody would look at you twice hardly.
Oh, well, I remember when we were driving around looking for the secret saucer base at Mount Shasta, and we got locked into that farmer's field, and
Oh
we went
yeah,
and talked to him, and there's you in your monk's robes, and there's me looking like, a stage double for Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead, and I just could see in his eyes, yep, that's normal Californians. Look at those two. Yeah, I think at that point we blended right in with the California scene in many ways, but it must have been much different in the 90s to walk around like that. So this actually brings up something I've been meaning to ask you about. As you mentioned, even strict monks will sometimes, bend the rules. Now, when you were in Burma, you mentioned before that there are monks that are stricter than others and monks that are less strict. Do the stricter monks hang out? I mean, did you hang out with other strict monks? Did you guys get together, or are there like strict monk associations or something, even informal kind of cliques?
Well, I pretty much avoided all other Burmese monks. Just, I don't know. It was just, I was just doing my own thing. I wasn't really following Burmese Buddhism. I didn't become a monk in order to follow along with what the Burmese monks were doing. Although some monasteries are strict. So like Pa'aut Doya in southern Burma is very strict. You have to follow the rules, or at least you have to look like you're following the rules. If you're keeping money or handling money, you got to do it secretly, so that
very discreetly. Yeah.
the abbot doesn't see you doing it. Yeah. So I mean, some monasteries are stricter, and then some sects, or there's different traditions that are stricter than others. Like in Burma, the two main sects of Buddhism are Thudama and Shuijin. And like in Thailand, it's much better known that you got the Mahanikaya and the Dhammayut. And the Dhammayut are much stricter than the Mahanikaya monks. So there's that too. Although in Burma, there's some of the Shuijin monks who are supposedly the stricter of the two sects they're just shameless too. So
wow.
Like in Burma, possibly in Southeast Asia in general, about 98% of monks don't even try to follow the rules or become enlightened or anything like that.
Really? 90%?
They're sort of like secular clergy or something.
Right. Well,
sort of like in Christianity. I mean, how many Christians gather not up their treasures upon the earth? And
yeah.
It says it in the books, but it's like, well, that doesn't apply to us anymore. Right. That's like in ancient India or something.
Who pointed out all the churches really care about are like sexual irregularities. You can be slothful, greedy. Any of the other sediment deadly sins are more or less, heck, they're important to capitalism. So no, but I'm reminded of something I read. I forget now who it was, but he was criticized for not following the Buddhist traditions of his country. And he said, I don't want to follow the Buddhist traditions of the country. I want to follow the tradition of the noble ones. I'm following the Buddhist traditions, not Burmese or Thai or Sinhalese or whatever kind of tradition. And of course, the lone practitioner is an important part of the Buddhist tradition, the forest ascetic going out into the woods. Now, when you were out in the forests and doing your thing, you mentioned to me before that you knew other people that did this, including we've talked before about the gentleman that lived in a tree, the hermit who lived in a tree.
Yeah, he was ordained in the same tradition as me, and he was sort of held up as like the great shining example because he was very strict. I mean, extremely strict to the point of, he was more fanatical than me when he was when he was really going for it.
I'm impressed.
Yeah, and like for example, one story about him is he was in California for a short time, and he was asked to give a Dhamma talk to this group. It was like a meditation retreat going on at the monastery or something. So he consented, and so he comes and sits down in front of everybody, and then he just sits there in silence. And he sits there in silence for maybe 5 minutes and then just gets up and walks out. And so like the leader of the retreat chases after him and asks him why he did that. And he said, it's against the rules to teach Dhamma to someone wearing a hat. And it was during the winter time and someone had like a stocking cap on and he just wouldn't.
Wow.
Yeah, he was strict like that. And then he dropped out of the monkhood. His name was, he legally changed his name to it's his Pali name plus Bhikkhu. His last name was Bhikkhu. And then he dropped out. But, he was still kind of fanatical. He was just trying too hard, I think. I think that was part of it. Plus, it's just universal that it never turns out the way you expect. It's like you make progress in Dhamma, but it's not going to be the kind of Dhamma that you're expecting, progress in Dhamma that you're expecting to make. You know, it's like the way you imagine it. You got this, unenlightened, kind of silly, childish idea of how it's going to be, and then the reality is different from that. But anyway, I think he was just trying too hard. At one point, he really did. He just cracked up. He was trying so hard.
Wow.
And like, for example, he was sleeping in a sitting position. He wouldn't even lean back against anything. He would just lean forwards and rest his forehead on his alms bowl and sleep that way. And he wasn't getting much sleep doing that. So he had like a breakdown. And then as soon as he went back to America, they had to put him on the plane. He was really in a bad way. And as soon as he got better, he just came back to Burma and reordained. And then when he dropped out of the monkhood, I mean, deep down, he still had faith in Dhamma. It's just at the surface level, he was just saying, well, the Buddha was just like an ancient Joseph Goldstein and all this kind of stuff. But he was still like an ascetic. He was still like a hermit, and he was living in this big hollow banyan tree. That was kind of interesting. I was inside of his tree a few times. I'd go hang out with him sometimes.
So that was the closest there was any kind of association of strict monks, or like a strict monk union or something like that. I just figured you'd have like a network or something, No,
there's not really a network. Although, like I said before, there are like famously strict monasteries with famously strict abbots, and a lot of strict monks will go to those places.
Interesting. So what happened to your friend that lived in a tree? Is he still there living in a tree, or did he drop out and become an accountant or something?
Actually, there started being lots of chicken farms around the tree, and just the stink of chicken shit kind of drove him out of the area. And last I heard, which was several years ago, he was living in Rangoon. That there was one of the main supporters of Taungpulu Sayadaw, who was the founder of the tradition in which I was ordained. He just had this 2-story building built in his yard for monks to stay in when they were visiting.
Oh.
When they're in Rangoon, they got something to do. They can just stay in this building. That's nice. So he was living in the upstairs of that building. Last I heard.
Oh.
I have no idea what has become of him.
Well, probably still on some sort of a path anyway, one would think.
Yeah, I don't think he's going to go back to just being a secular layperson again.
Not that being a secular layperson isn't a path in and of itself, as we know, but we're not going to talk about that tonight. Actually, my friend, I think we've just about run out of our time. Was there anything else you'd like to add regarding either changing perspectives and as you travel along the path, or about happiness kicking butt?
I could give one example of how changing perceptions can make your behavior very different. And that is, my father smoked 2 packs a day, cigarettes, tobacco. And he tried quitting smoking a number of times. And he'd start like chewing a little tobacco or smoking a pipe occasionally. And then, next thing you know, he's back to 2 packs a day. Until one day, his legs started turning black. So he went to the doctor, and he was a longshoreman, and he had a log that crushed that leg. It rolled over his leg, and it messed up the capillaries in that leg. I mean, he was still fine, he was walking on it and everything, but there was capillary damage, and it was the capillaries are getting clogged with tar from smoking. And so the doctor told him that you're going to have to stop smoking, or we're going to have to amputate your leg. And then all of a sudden, he was able to stop smoking like relatively.
Wow.
The intensity of the urges were the same. The addiction, the cravings and so forth were the same. But when it's a matter of, if you keep smoking, your legs are going to get amputated. It's much easier to just say, nope, you just push it out of your mind. It's just not appropriate, not going to do it, not going to go there. And to some degree, being a monk was similar. It's like certain rules, if you break them, it's very difficult to, it's just really inconvenient. Like, you touch a woman and you enjoy it, then you've got to do penance for 6 days and 6 nights. There's like 100 different penances, and you've got to go through this long ceremony with at least 20 monks that are all in good standing, so that you can be back in good standing again. And it's such a hassle, such a headache,
Right.
that it makes it easier to resist the urges. So it's just the change of perception. It's not like, it's very difficult to do something like stop smoking, or whatever it is, but it's if you're if you don't have a really clear, obvious reason not to do it, then if the mood, you're just in a certain kind of mood, you're just gonna do it.
Right.
Unless you've got some really, solid, or else you become so wise that you realize that it's just not serving you. It's just sort of self-destructive or self-harming or whatever. Once you get to that level of perception, then you can just see that it's just not appropriate.
But in the meantime, you have the support system of the Sangha around you, keeping you, well, like you were saying, if suddenly you've got to go through 6 days of amazingly difficult and pain in the butt penance for this one little act, I see that as support for your intention to, not engage in this. So, but then you get to that point where you can say, no, it's not worth it. I'm not going to go there because, you've got your reasoning improves as your perception changes.
Yeah, and it's not even necessarily reasoning. You just start seeing things clearly.
Okay. Being able to receive. Well, it is all about, I think, just seeing clearly what we're doing. It's when we act unskillfully, I always think it's because we just don't know what we're doing. If we could see clearly where we were at, we would be much better off and much happier, I think. And maybe that's why those Burmese hillbillies are much happier. They see more clearly where they are. With their home, with their family, right here, with their wife and children. They're not in La La Land thinking, why don't I have that car?
Yeah, I don't know if they're really happier than we are, but they're less unhappy. I think there's a certain balance, positive and negative balance out. And Westerners have more fun, but also they have more of the opposite.
Oh, yeah.
And that's kind of what a monk is trying to do. Is he's trying to, if you don't want any kind of suffering, you've got to avoid the happiness too. So he's just going for like pure neutrality of just smooth waters instead of up and down.
Yeah. C.S. Lewis used to talk about undulation, that we undulate, we go up and down and up and down. And,
roller coaster ride.
And as one advances along the path, one learns to be more in control. I always think of it as like you're riding a sea serpent or something, and you've got like reins, and you're just trying to rein it in. And it's nothing wrong with going up and nothing wrong with going down. These things are going to happen, but you want to be more in control of it. You don't want it to like overcome you.
Yeah, you want to be able to surf the waves instead of wiping out too.
Right. Maybe at this point I'll cue the music Wipeout for the video.
Oh yeah.
Well, all right. I think it's time we sign off for now, but thank you very, very much for coming on the show and talking with us. I look forward to talking with you again. Perhaps we can talk about a projected Navakavadan Sangha, although I have a feeling now it would be a bunch of people dressed in black, speaking in riddles and hitting each other with sticks, which might be kind of fun, actually, depending on how...
there'd have to be some sort of release that you'd have to sign that you're not going to sue hit you with the stick.
You're thinking ahead already. That's why you're patriarch.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks very much for being here, and we'll be seeing you again sometime. And everybody out there in Navakavada land, meta.
Yeah.